world moves fast. Your workday? Even faster. Pitching products, drafting reports, analyzing data. Microsoft 365 Copilot is your AI assistant for work. Built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and other Microsoft 365 apps you use. Helping you quickly write, analyze, create, and summarize. So you can cut through clutter and clear a path to your best work. Learn more at Microsoft.com/M365 Copilot.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello friend. Do come in, relax, make yourself comfortable, and welcome to the History Book Club. A club that welcomes all history lovers. Drink? Now, shall we begin? Herodotus is known as the father of history, and the next historian out the blocks, Thucydides, took the idea, and it was very much an idea in infancy, and produced a work that is still discussed by politicians and generals 2,500 years later. Indeed, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, quoted Thucydides in a recent speech. There is a new translation of the history of the Peloponnesian War by the great translator Robin Waterfield, and he enters the club with historian Polly Lowe to discuss Thucydides, his style as a historian, the Peloponnesian War, what Thucydides was getting at, what is Thucydidean, and much, much more. Now, if you can give this pod a kind rating or a 5-star review, I'd be so happy. And please do share with friends and strangers. But until then, let's head straight on in, shall we? Hello, Polly. Hello, Robin. Thank you very much for joining me. It's a huge pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, great. So I was very excited about this when I saw a copy of this new translation. So I thought what we'd do today was maybe, Robin, I'd kick off just to ask you a few questions about the translation. Then, Polly, you're the expert on Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about that. But Robin, I wanted to ask why. I mean, you've translated a number of different works. Is it unfair of me to say Thucydides is a little bit of a departure for you in that it's more of a kind of straight history? Well, I don't know if that's probably very unfair to describe Thucydides like that. But why did you want to translate Thucydides?
Because I like a challenge. I've been doing translations for over 40 years, and Thucydides has always been in the back of my mind as something that I'd like to do. But when I was working for Penguin Classics, they already have a Thucydides, obviously. Same for Oxford World's Classics when I jumped ship from Penguin to Oxford. But then I got in with Basic Books, who are the publishers of Thucydides, and they liked my work, and so I said, "Oh, can I do Thucydides?" And here we are. So that's it. I mean, it was a kind of a selfish reason, but the thing is, Oliver, that as a translator, and I think this applies to any writer or any artist of any kind, you have to believe that you can do a good job, that you can do a better job than others. And so, armed with that belief, I set about it.
Right. So, I mean, I've lots to ask you there, but and it's great to hear that Thucydides has a publisher 2,500 years later as well. I'm sure we'd all want that. In your introduction, before we get underway in the translation, you mention a few other of your predecessors who've translated. And you mentioned Penguin, because I was very disappointed Rex Warner didn't get a mention. And so what do you think of his translation, which for the benefit of listeners is, I think, the Penguin classic one?
Yes, it is. And still in print after many, many years. It's a good translation, but it's not. There are basically every translation is a tightrope walk, an act of balance between over translating and crib style translating, more too literal translation. In my opinion, both the Penguin, Rex Warner, and Martin Hammond's Oxford World's Classic go slightly too far in the direction of free translation, where they sort of pad out what Thucydides has said to make it better English or to make it more comprehensible English, something like that. At the other at the other extreme, you get crib style translations. The one of Thucydides is by Stephen Lattimore, and he was determined to kind of keep all the features of Thucydides' style in English, and that for me just simply doesn't work. Um, but the Cambridge University Press one by Jeremy Minot is, I think, very good, but it's very expensive. So I'm hoping that Basic Books can undercut that price.
Yes. And what about the Hobbes translation? Do you have a copy of that?
Do you know, I've never read it.
Right.
Not from start to finish, anyway. I've dipped into it in libraries. I don't have a copy on my shelves. From my dipping, it is justly famous, but of course you can't write in that kind of English nowadays.
No, no, you can't. And I have to ask, this is probably going to sound as a very stupid question, but where does one actually find the original Greek? I mean, are you looking at sort of manuscripts that were translated or that were sort of copied down by monks in the medieval period?
If I were preparing, I don't know, let's say a scholarly commentary on Thucydides to be published by Oxford University Press and sold just to libraries, then yes, I would have to consult the manuscripts. But as a translator, no. I mean, for all Greek texts, for all Latin texts as well, we're heavily reliant on 2 centuries of work, particularly in the 19th century by German scholars who were looking at the manuscripts and establishing texts and correcting the mistakes that inevitably creep in a scribal tradition. I mean, we know from our own handwriting and typing that we introduce errors, and the scribes did a lot. So you have a standard text, or you have two or three published standard texts, and you pick the one which you think is best, and you translate that one. But having said that, there's never ever been a translation that I've done where I haven't tweaked the received text to a certain extent. Um, um, and I think every translator does that.
Fascinating stuff. Polly, I wonder if I can bring you in here and as our kind of Thuc expert, I'm going to call him Thuc because that's what my tutor used to call him, and I can't get it out of my head. But are
Who
you?
was your tutor?
Well, it was James Morwood at school. Do you remember
Right.
him?
Yeah.
Wonderful man. But Thucydides is the kind of okay, Herodotus is father of history, but I wonder, Polly, if you maybe could help explain who Thucydides was for some listeners who may not be aware.
Yes. So, I mean, he's closer in date to Herodotus than we tend to think. I think that's one thing is that, I mean, Herodotus is slightly earlier and, of course, writes about an earlier period, but they overlap and they're sort of working in the same intellectual environment or a similar intellectual environment. And I think one really critical thing, we might come on to this later, is that they're both working at a time when there aren't yet any established rules for what history should look like. So the genre of prose history writing is still new, and Herodotus and Thucydides sort of go down quite different routes about sort of what a history should look like. Thucydides, we know that he's Athenian. He tells us that right at the start. We know that he was elected as a general, so from that we infer that he is relatively prominent in Athens. General is one of the very few posts you have to stand for election to get that post, rather than just having your name drawn in the lottery, which is what the Athenians mostly do. Um, we know that he's not very successful as a general, in fact, notably unsuccessful because he suffers or causes is implicated in a really significant defeat during the Peloponnesian War and gets exiled during the war. So he's kicked out of Athens halfway through the war. So he's very involved in the war, and that's also important because one of the things that his history is sort of known for is this sense of being very objective and quite detached. But the sort of paradox is that it's written by someone who is absolutely tied up and involved and very personally affected by the war. And the other thing we know is that he's probably very rich, or at least his father and his family is involved in precious metal mining up in northern Greece. So he's part of, I guess, what we'd call the elite of Athens until it all goes wrong.
And you mentioned his experience as a general, which, as you say, doesn't go well. Do you think then, because he comes a cropper against the Spartan general, who he then in his history he is very generous about. Do you think that betrays a kind of a wider? I don't know if it does or not. But that betrays something in his history in that it was Brasidas, who is the Spartan general who defeats
Yeah.
Thucydides. Was he as good as Thucydides says he is? Because we only really have to rely on Thucydides. We have to take his word for it.
So, I mean, I think we can safely say Brasidas must have been an effective general because unless we want to think that Thucydides just fabricates an enormous amount of what happens up in that theatre, then clearly Brasidas did manage some quite significant achievements. It's a really, I think you put your finger on sort of critical question about Thucydides that we could ask about lots of things that he tells us is that it's really hard to know because we have so little by way of non-Thucydidean evidence. So we don't have another detailed contemporary portrait of what Brasidas was like. So I think you're quite right that we should be suspicious that Thucydides is painting this, or that one of the things that is feeding into the way Thucydides portrays Brasidas is the fact that Brasidas was the man who defeated Thucydides. So, it would make sense that Thucydides wants to make him seem like a military genius. But it's very hard to go, I think, further than that in sort of knowing exactly how distorted the picture of Brasidas is, because the other thing that is definitely happening in that portrayal is that Brasidas is being characterized as a very atypical Spartan. So from the start of the work, Thucydides builds up this picture of the Spartans as very sort of small c conservative, quite timid in a sort of unexpected way, reluctant to go too far outside the Peloponnese, not very good at innovating, not very good at speaking. And Brasidas is sort of the opposite of all of those. So
Yeah, Thucydides says he was quite a good speaker for a Spartan.
Well, there's another brilliant which I actually haven't got to in your translation because it's towards the end of the Peloponnesian War when there's a famously laconic message sent by the Spartans after a defeat. Was it Arginusae? I can't remember, where they basically just send a message, and I don't know how you translated it, Robin, where they send a message saying, ships sunk, men dead.
Don't know what to do.
Right.
Yeah, I find it difficult to translate anaphora very literally. It doesn't come across quite so well in English as it does in Greek, I think. So I tend to put a connective in an and or a but or something at some point in the list of anaphoric words.
I think you're best placed to create words if they don't.
Especially when they're Greek roots.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And Thucydides, Polly, I think, dies after the end of the Peloponnesian War, but that's not. He doesn't manage to finish the history.
yes, so I mean we don't know exactly when he dies, but the sort of guesstimate is sometime around the very end of the 5th century, start of the fourth. But we know that he knew what happened at the end of the war because there's a couple of proleptic flash forward references in the text that talk about the very end of the war. So we know he must have been alive in 4043 when the war comes to an end. But you're right, he doesn't narrate. So the work breaks off in sort of 411-ish and gives every sign of being unfinished, partly because he gives the impression earlier on that he is going to narrate the end of the war, but also, and Robin's better placed to talk about the sort of linguistic clues at the end of the book, the last chapter that sort of breaks off or not quite halfway through a sentence, but it seems very, very unfinished. So, and there's other sort of indications of incompleteness in the work. So, yeah, general assumption is that he didn't finish it. Whether that's just because he sort of died halfway through a sentence, or whether he gave up and just found that he couldn't somehow bring this work to a conclusion, I think that's more open
Yeah.
for discussion.
It's not the. Sorry to.
I absolutely think he died and was going to finish the work. I think I'm one of those. Not everybody agrees with this, but I kind of think that book 8, the final book, is unfinished. Polly can go into the details better than I, but I mean we haven't got any speeches, any Oratio Rector speeches in it. We've only got reported speeches, Oratio Obliqua, and I think it's plausible to think that Thucydides was going to turn those speeches into Oratio Rector, but didn't get around to it. Do you agree with that, Polly?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, the other really striking thing in the work as a whole is there's almost nothing about Persia. Persia is very underreported, and one unprovable theory, but I quite like it, is that that was because the closing books, if he'd written them, would have been the sort of that's where the role of Persia would have been more fully
Yeah.
developed and explained. So that's one of the weird omissions in the main text, is that Persia, which has been such a big part and sort of obviously central to Herodotean history, is almost invisible in Thucydides' narrative.
So we should get on to some of the passages that are really stand out. I mean, I had a few, but they're by no means exhaustive. But I remember when I first started reading Thucydides, the Pentacontiatia, which is the sort of it's almost an introduction in that it sort of sets the reader up for the beginning of the Peloponnesian War in 431. So this is a sort of 50-year period after the immediate conclusion of the Persian Wars, the Greco-Persian Wars. How unusual is it for a writer in the ancient world to do something like that? And I don't really know, who wants to sort of answer that.
Do you mean to go back in time
Yeah, really go back
to
50
preface
years.
it? Yeah.
I mean, it's not a short. It's not done over sort of 5 pages. This is
No.
a serious piece of work.
Well, Polybius goes back in time as well. Um, Polly, anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, and Herodotus as well is sort of always sort of
Well, he's jumping around.
yes, jumping around. And I think generally the structure of book one as a commentary, I think just come out or just about to come out on book one, which sort of tries to analyze the structure. It's more complicated than most of the other books. I mean, Thucydides is very insistent and quite proud of his. He also presents it as innovation, his method of telling the story of the war itself sequentially, year by year, summer and winter. And so we're just going in a straight line. But in some ways, the structure of book one is a bit closer to the sort of more confusing structure that we find in Herodotus, which jumps around. So we start and then we go back to very early history, and then we have a little bit of what was happening in the 430s, and then we jump back again into the Pentacontiatia, and then we jump back to the 430s. So that sort of non-linear narrative structure is unlike the rest of Thucydides, but maybe less unlike other ways of telling history that were around in Thucydides' time.
Hmm. Is this Geoffrey Ruston?
That's Ruston's commentary.
Good. Looking forward to him.
Interesting. And actually, and as we're talking about this period, which is around about when Herodotus is writing his history of the Persian Wars, I always think that the two, Herodotus and Thucydides, complement each other so sort of brilliantly, but they are very different. So I wondered whether you could just, Robin, how do the two compare? I would really, perhaps even facetiously, describe Herodotus as a hugely enjoyable, fun read, and Thucydides slightly more serious. But how do you view the two?
Well, picking up on something Polly said earlier, you know, the nature of history writing was not yet fixed. It was still malleable. And I mean, if you look at Xenophon's main historical work, the Hellenica, that again is completely different from either Herodotus or Thucydides. some bits of it are Herodotean in tone, some bits of it are Thucydidean in tone, but he's definitely ploughing his own furrow, a totally different type of historiography. So yeah, I think that's all I would say. They're just different people writing in the same genre.
How would we assess them today then? If I were to write a history of, I don't know, the Second World War in the style of Herodotus, would my review in the Times be a 5-star review, do you think?
Depends what you said about Eva Brown.
Yes.
Because you'd have to bring her in. She'd be a major influence.
Yeah,
Cherchez la femme is the beginning of Herodotus's history.
I guess what I'm getting at, Polly, is that Herodotus is often criticized. Thucydides, I think, is also criticized for something we've touched on, where you have a speech, and Thucydides sort of is very straight up explaining that he thinks this is what might have been said or what should have been said, I think.
Well, that's one of the hardest to translate. I have to defer to Robin because I think it's a deliberately sort of convoluted, tying itself in knot sentence of when Thucydides sort of says what he has, how much invention he's allowed himself
He says
in composing
if
his
I
speeches.
remember it rightly, he says that he's written what he felt that the speaker would have needed to say at the time. And then he adds, as a subordinate clause, while sticking as close as possible to the truth. But I mean, going back to this difference between Herodotus and Thucydides and even Xenophon as well, is that because the essential question to ask about any historian, isn't it, is can we trust him? And I think the main thing about Thucydides is that he really does give the impression that he's done his research thoroughly, and that we can, he's into with Xenophon. To go back to that, you get the impression that he's relying very largely on his memory and on the memories of other people whom he trusted and interviewed before writing up. But with Thucydides, you get the impression that he wouldn't have. He didn't want that casual an approach. He really did it thoroughly. But whether that's a fake impression because he's just so skillful at the way he writes, that's another question. But I think he's trustworthy.
Well, that leads me to ask about a key part of his book, which is the Sicilian expedition in 415 BC. Which is there in your translation, Robin? Is there evidence that Thucydides did actually travel to Sicily and walk the ground? Or, I mean, I don't know if evidence, but did it become sort of fairly clear that he did do that? I mean, that's quite a journey to take if you want to walk the battlefield.
I don't know, but there are certain features of the account where he is assuming knowledge of the local topography. He says things like, I don't know, turn right at the roundhouse, or, go past the pyramid, without explaining what the pyramid is. So he's definitely relying on eyewitnesses, but whether it was his own, I would hesitate to say. I don't know. But it wasn't too bad a journey.
Oh, right.
To Sicily. I mean, Plato did it 3 times, a couple of decades later, or, so I think it was because you could coast it. So I think it was a fairly normal journey.
Okay, that's good to hear. I have visions of, an Odyssean adventure. Members of the History Book Club, please forgive my interruption, but I have an important request. A friend of mine, Ian Wilson Young, yes indeed, all surnames are double-barreled here at the History Book Club. Anyway, Ian is on a mission to Ukraine, whereby he purchases a pickup truck and fills it with medical supplies before heading out close to the front lines to provide support for those fighting the Russian hordes. This is an appeal for you to donate, even if it's a very small amount. I put a link in the show notes to the Just Giving page. Now, let's return to the club. We're speaking a few days after the Prime Minister of Canada has employed Thucydides to make a point in his speech. And I don't want to linger too long on the Prime Minister of Canada, but it really speaks well, I mean, you can if you like, if you think that he was right. But Thucydides is used often by politicians, by generals and military people. I mean, Polly, do you sort of groan inwardly anytime some politician can understand, because they're using it to persuade people to vote for them effectively. But do you groan inwardly when you do hear Thucydides invoked?
I might do, but I shouldn't do, I think. Partly because what's the point of us reading and studying and thinking about these texts if they don't still have some meaning or resonance for contemporary society? So I might disagree with the use that people, the things that people are finding in the text, but I can't be annoyed if people are finding useful ideas or sort of stuff they want to play with in Thucydides or any classical text, because then that would put me out of a job ultimately. But the other reason why I think we shouldn't be too upset, I mean, Thucydides himself would I think be very happy with that this is going on, because it's one of the things he says at the start of the work is that that's one of his reasons why he wrote it. Reason A was to give, as Robin said, he thought he was providing an accurate, truthful account of this war, which he thought was important, and that is a key goal, that sort of historical method that he claims to have developed. But another reason why he says that he needs to do this is because events are likely to recur in a similar sort of way, and if you read his history, you won't necessarily be able to make things any better, but you'll understand what's going on. It'll give you a sort of toolkit for diagnosing what's wrong with your own society. So again, we could argue about whether he's right on that, on the sort of universality of certain aspects of human behaviour. But Thucydides thought that this was a reason for writing and for reading the history.
Do you think then, if we are speaking about, particularly this is a passage, I think, from the Melian dialogues. And again, I'm going to paraphrase Robin, please forgive me, but effectively, might is right. You know, the weak do what they shall, the strong do what they shall, and the weak suffer as they must. But that's not what you've translated it as, Robin. I should make that very clear.
I'm trying to find my translation now.
Yeah, I know. I've got it. I think it's somewhere. But yes, if we're still mentioning this kind of phrase in 2026. Surely that proves Thucydides is right about this, human nature.
Well, I think one really important thing to be aware of, and maybe one reason why we are still thinking about his ideas, is that it's not at all clear that that's what Thucydides himself thought. So the context, one of the things that does make me grumpy is the tendency to decontextualize, just grab a soundbite out of Thucydides and not think about where does that come from. So as you say, this comes from a dialogue. It comes from a long, very sort of well worked out, thoughtful and thought-provoking section of the work, which is all about power. And how do we respond to power? What are the obligations of the people who have power, and how do the weak respond to this? So it's that sort of might is right claim is made by the Athenians, but it's not at all clear that the Athenians are correct in what they say.
Yeah.
It's not obvious that the Melians, who are resisting Athenian power, are necessarily right either, because the Melians, most of them end up dead or enslaved. But the Athenians also end up losing their empire. We're leading into the Sicilian expedition. That's the next thing that happens in the work, which is going to be absolutely disastrous. So I think the fact that, as you say, people still talk about this proves that it's a really important idea. To ask the question, is it the case that might is right and that the strong can do what they want? But what Thucydides doesn't tell us is that's true, that's right. He tells us that that's something that is complicated and there isn't an obvious answer to that question, I think.
He also doesn't say that it's inevitable that two superpowers will clash, which is the use that he's being put to a lot these days. America is bound to have to go to war with China and that kind of stuff. But he doesn't say it's inevitable.
Well, I mean, we had a Cold War where, whilst there were proxies, but ultimately the United States never fought directly the Soviets. So yes, it's quite possible. We're not all going to die in a huge fireball if we do fight China. I guess the Mytilenean debate, which is where Am I right in that Thucydides, we get a kind of a moral standard emerges from Thucydides, which perhaps would provide some kind of a counterbalance to this sort of theory that Thucydides thought, might is right and the strong would overcome the weak. In that there is a decision that is that we're talking 427 BC. Am I getting
Yeah.
that right?
But I don't think you're going in the right direction, Oliver, because one of the things that categorize, okay, so you've got Cleon saying kill all Mytileneans, and Diodotus, a man who we don't otherwise know anything about, saying no, let's have some mercy. But both of their arguments are arguments from expediency. Diodotus isn't taking the moral high ground. He's saying Athenians, it will be better for you if you are merciful. He's not saying because it's the right thing to do, because it's the moral thing to do. He's saying it's because it's the expedient thing to do. So that's kind of sometimes overlooked on a superficial reading of the Mytilenean debate. But Polly, do you agree? I think that's an important part of it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if anything, Cleon, who's arguing for the more brutal thing, which is kill everyone, his argument in some ways could be characterized as more moral because he's saying, or a certain version of morality, that the Mytileneans have done wrong to the Athenians, and therefore the just thing to do is to punish them in return. So it's a version of justice. And yeah, I completely agree with Robin. Diodotus is making the argument for just self-interest. It's not in the Athenians' interest to go down this route. The other thing about the Mytilenean debate, and this is another argument for always sort of thinking about the context, is that, and this is something that recurs in the way Thucydides sort of frames his set piece speeches, we have this set piece debate, and at the end of it, the vote is still very, very close.
Very
So it's not
close.
the case that either speaker manages to really make a knockdown argument that completely wins over the Athenians. It's almost equally balanced. And ultimately, what the Athenians do is they don't kill the entire population, but they still kill a significant number of Mytileneans and confiscate all their land. So it's not like they've become soft in listening to Diodotus. So yeah, again, I think it's an amazing pair of speeches, and it's playing with really important and difficult ideas, but it's not at all clear. Is one of these the moral or the amoral course of action? And it's not obvious which is actually the sort of the course of action that Thucydides would endorse out of the two that he gives us.
When I studied ancient history, we would read, and this is in the 90s, so this is a long time ago, and you would read the small passage in Thucydides where, with Milos, the men are killed and the women and children are enslaved, and then we move on. Now, I wondered how that changes today, because perhaps that line is a little bit more, I don't know, does that cause a bit more of a response amongst the students that you teach, Polly? Because at the time I remember I not really thinking about it. Okay, yes, the island is effectively destroyed, but then we're off to the next episode. How is that kind of taught today?
Yeah, I think there is more attempt to focus on the sort of the victims and the sort of subaltern perspectives on in warfare on the Athenian in the Athenian Empire. It's very hard to do because the evidence is so almost non-existent. Sort of what happens? What would the experience be like if you're a Melian woman who gets sold into slavery? We just don't know. We can't. I don't think we have any evidence for what happens to the Melian women. We assume it's not great,
Not nice.
but it's very hard. So I think there is an effort to sort of at least draw attention to these experiences, but it's difficult to get much further. There's a very interesting project that a doctoral student in Oxford is doing at the moment about refugee populations, migrant populations. What happens
Topical.
when communities are displaced and they sort of because we there's some that we can say a little bit more about. So the Plataeans who feature at the
Yeah.
in book two, who lose their city, are almost wiped out, but not totally, and go to Athens as refugees. And then that happens more than once to the poor Plataeans who repeatedly get kicked out of their city. So that's a community where we can say a bit more about sort of what their experience was like. So there's a desire to think more about the victims of war, but there are challenges in doing that.
I just want to add a slight rider as a translator because, I've countless times I've translated, and the entire city was razed to the ground. This is always an exaggeration by the writer. Archaeology proves the continuing existence of these places that are always said to be razed to the ground. And so, likewise, I think when one reads, all the women and children were enslaved, I think that means all the women and children they could lay their hands on. So I don't think oh yeah, Milos was repopulated by Athenian clearest colonists, but I think we should still imagine there were plenty of Melians still on the island. Anyway, that's just it worries me when I have to translate these exaggerated things.
Yeah. And one thing that I'd never really thought, the Peloponnesian War, I never really thought about it like this until I was speaking to someone sort of recently. So, I mean, obviously I was a very inferior undergraduate, but I mean, the Corsairian Civil War sort of kicks things off. I guess it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. But should we view the history, the Peloponnesian War as a civil war? Robin? And then Polly.
I mean, I think no. The pan-Hellenic sentiment that we're all Greeks together is at this stage in the 5th century and the early 4th century is really quite rare. You get some intellectuals like Gorgias and others promoting the idea, but even so, it's a funny version of the idea. They're not necessarily saying, let's all buddy up because we're all Greeks together. They're saying, let's all buddy up and go and beat up the Persians, which is not quite the same thing. No, I mean, Greeks enslaved fellow Greeks. They obviously were capable of thinking of them as enemies, real enemies, other than themselves. That would be my take on it anyway.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the sort of Peloponnesian War as civil war, but you have to read Thucydides a little bit against the grain to find it, because I think Robin's right that the sort of pan-Hellenic sentiment is all, not completely but almost invisible in the text. But it crops up every so often. So the bit after the defeat of Plataea, and the Plataeans try to persuade the Spartans not to destroy their city, and what they try and invoke this sort of pan-Hellenic
Yeah.
fellow feeling, and particularly the role of Plataea in the Persian wars, and the fact that Spartans are buried at Plataea, and this would be a sort of betrayal of something that tied Sparta and Plataea together, even though they were now enemies. But the key thing is that it doesn't work. So these sorts of arguments don't have any power in the world that Thucydides is describing. So I think maybe we can sort of see glimmers of a world in which the Greeks were more united than they are, but that's not the world that Thucydides is describing.
Would that mean then that they're kind of, because Spartans are Dorians and Athenians are Ionian Greeks? Is that a sort of ethnic distinction that you should keep in mind, or it's not as significant as perhaps it suggests?
Well, Thucydides stresses it a lot. He considers it significant. But it's still a good question as to how significant it was.
Yeah. And he also, again, sort of stresses it, but also allows us to question it, so particularly in the Sicilian expedition. So this great catalogue, almost sort of before the final decisive encounters in Sicily, and he lists the forces on both sides, and he keeps talking about Ionians and Dorians in that catalogue, but also keeps saying, sort of pointing out that people aren't quite on the right side. So there are Ionians fighting on the Spartan side, and there are Dorians fighting on the Athenian side. So he's very interested in that Ionian-Dorian division, but I think also maybe doesn't quite believe that that things are so neat and tidy.
Well, you mentioned about, refugees and Plataeans moving into the city of Athens, and this is one major element to the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, is the plague. And that prompts this funeral oration that is a wonderful passage in Thucydides. Robin, was this a passage that it's hugely famous? I think we see it on the, I think it's inscribed on the Bomber Command Memorial at Hyde Park.
And when there are also bits of it on the sides of buses in the First World War.
Right, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
well, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it was terrifying to translate, Oliver. Absolutely terrifying, because I knew that my translation was going to be judged on this speech more than anything else. So I worked at it and reworked at it, and there was one very important, very last minute change prompted by our mutual friend Paul Cartledge. But yeah, it was tough. But I mean, all the speeches are tough. That one was tougher because it's so famous, but the Thucydides speeches are really difficult. He has basically two styles. When he's just doing straight narration, a battle scene or some geography or something like that, the Greek is really pretty straightforward, and that's why Morwood was introducing you to it in the sixth form. Because you were capable of, it's possible to. But the speeches, and when he is analyzing events rather than just narrating them, the Greek's pretty damn difficult.
just drilling into that a little bit more. Why is it so difficult?
You get very, very long sentences, which can go on for, half a page. Greek has this ability to build up participle clauses one after another, adding on, so you get this great weight of sentences. He uses a lot of abstract nouns, superlatives, long, complex verbs with multiple prefixes to really pinpoint exactly the impression he's trying to give, which is impossible to translate. Just to slightly explain that, I mean, for instance, in the text, I think there are something like a dozen different words for to attack. Now, every single one of those words must have had a slightly different vibe for Thucydides, but I don't think I would have captured it in the English anyway, because it doesn't really work. Have I lost the thread? What were we talking about?
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, I'm really enjoying hearing how, Thucydides writes. It's
Yeah, but no, that's the basic point. The speeches are very difficult. Very
right,
difficult.
right. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful. I'm trying to think now. So Thucydides' influence on historians today. I know we mentioned, how we assess him as a historian, but do you, Polly? He goes beyond ancient history, certainly. And as I mentioned, American military academies can't get enough of him. Is it only American military academies? We're always
And I
told
think
that.
he is also taught. I was talking to someone actually at a conference last week who had been going to Sandhurst or somewhere in the UK. So I think he is read sort of more widely, and read a lot also still in the discipline of international relations, international theory, because they like to read things like the Melian Dialogue and the Mytilene Debate and see the sort of articulation of so-called realist theory, this sort of might is right theory, and they use Thucydides as the exemplar of that way of understanding international politics. What's striking as well, though, is that as international theory has developed and changed, that Thucydides hasn't gone out of fashion, but each sort of subsequent theoretical school has found a way to enlist Thucydides as really being one of them. So he's now much used in the strand of theory called constructivism, which is much more interested in the sort of social construction of how international politics works. But you can use Thucydides to talk about that as well. And that's one of the joys of the text, is that it's rich enough that people can find the things they need or want to find in it.
That is interesting, actually, because also I was thinking about this because it's a very, I don't know if I'm getting on dodgy ground here, but it's a very male, the Peloponnesian War, the history of the Peloponnesian War is quite a male kind of book, I think. Or at least I always felt it was probably because I was taught by just men about it as well.
It's the strikingly few. Robin will remember better than me. Are there three named women in the whole work? Something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
And there are some groups of unnamed women. So
But that was fairly standard Greek
yeah,
practice, though. A lot
yes,
of women are simply referred to as the wife of
yeah,
their husband.
yes,
They don't
because
get a name, but they're the wife of Pericles or the wife of Xanthippus or something like that.
respectable women shouldn't be named, is what we learn from Athenian law court
Pericles.
speeches. Yeah. But yes, no, you're right. It's a very, and again, it's very quite different from Herodotus's world, where which is there's more women, more non-Greeks, generally sort of a slightly more diverse world than the world of Thucydides. Um, and that I think did have an influence, to come back to your original question about sort of influence on history. History as it was written in the 19th, much of the 20th centuries was in terms of what it was interested in writing about, was politics and warfare and things done by men on the whole. And obviously, the discipline of history these days is
Wider.
rather broader interests. Yeah.
Great stuff. And one question I did have is that he was obviously a contemporary for a number of key figures, certainly in Athens, he would have known, presumably. Do you sense that there's one figure, Alcibiades, who's becomes increasingly prominent throughout the war, particularly with Sicily? Did you get a sense of any kind of, how he assessed him as a sort of character in the Greek? And I guess how you feel he should be assessed, Polly, historically?
Do you want to go first, Robin?
Well, I only want to say that, I mean, Thucydides would scarcely have known Alcibiades. I mean, Athens was a small enough place that, and both of them were from prominent families, so they would have moved in the same circles and so on. But Alcibiades didn't really become prominent until after Thucydides' exile. So whether he was able to, face to face assess his character and predict what an arsehole he was going to be, then that's a different matter.
Not a fan then, Robin?
Not really.
No, I think,
terrible human being, isn't he?
But I think Thucydides does give a very good explanation, or allow us to understand why Alcibiades was so good at what he did. I mean, with disastrous consequences, but I think he does sort of capture that sort of charisma of the man, and how he's able somehow to persuade the Athenians, but also the Spartans, and then also it goes off to Persia, and it sort of goes and pursues his own interest, but is able to persuade people to do really stupid things repeatedly. And I think that is something that Thucydides' account, and as Robin says, he probably didn't know him well, but so how he's been able to construct this picture of Alcibiades is a difficult question to answer. Yeah. But he has constructed this very compelling picture of the man.
So if we want to read a little bit more about the Peloponnesian War after his book 8, presumably this is Xenophon for listeners who are interested. This is really what we should follow on after.
Yeah. Hellenica, from the beginning of book 1 till about halfway through book 2, 2, 3, 9.
Although I can say as a plug, Robin very thoughtfully gives a potted history at the end of his translation, of sort of fills in the what happens next, so you can get the brief narrative of the last years of the war.
Yeah.
Well, Robin, this has been a wonderful achievement. And so, huge congratulations on finishing it. And thanks, Polly and Robin, for coming on and talking about it. For listeners, as always, links are in the show notes for a copy of this very handsome edition, beautifully done by Basic, actually.
They do a good job.
Yeah, they certainly did. But thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you once again for having us. And it's very nice to meet you.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time. I was
Why choose a Sleep Number smart bed?
Can I make my site softer?
Can I make my site firmer?
Can we sleep cooler?
Sleep Number does that. Cools up to 8 times faster and lets you choose your ideal comfort on either side, your Sleep Number setting. Enjoy personalized comfort for better sleep night after night. And now, during our President's Day sale, take 50% off our limited edition bed, plus free premium delivery with any bed and base. Ends Monday. Only at a Sleep Number store or sleepnumber.com.